Happening now, we want to welcome our viewers from across the United States and around the world. This is the EdTech Situation Room. Good morning, good day, good evening. It is September 5th, 2018. This is episode number 106 of the EdTech Situation Room. My name is Jason Eifer. I am the Assistant Director and Curriculum Director of the Montana Digital Academy, the state virtual school located in fabulous Missoula, Montana. And joining me tonight, as always, Dr. Wes Fryer, hopefully not having to build an ark in your location to stay away from the floods that are located in the Midwest. How are you this evening, sir?
I am doing great. And yes, it is a very unusual week. I feel like we've gone to the Pacific Northwest with cloudy skies and rain in our forecast every single day. So anyway, it is not 100 degrees, and that's nice because sometimes the August weather, gets prolonged here. So you are without smoke from California fires. Is that what I understand?
That is absolutely correct. We've had great weather here for almost 3 weeks now. The winds have been blowing in the correct directions, and so Missoula weather is delightful. In fact, I had an opportunity last night for the first time. Missoula has an extraordinary music scene. We have at least 5 venues now that pull in some pretty decent acts, but the 80s phenomenon Blondie was in town last night, and I know it was my first opportunity to go to the so-called Kettle House Amphitheater, which is a wonderful new venue located just outside of Missoula in Bonner, Montana. And I went because, I'm a kid of the 80s and I wanted to see Blondie. And by the way, at 73 years old, Debbie Harry still's got it. She's dancing all around the stage and was pumping out tunes. It was pretty great. Good mix of old and new stuff. But the Kettle House Amphitheater was also unreal. It was just a beautiful venue. It's right on the river. Beautiful mountains in the background. Really well thought out venue. And unlike 1 year ago this week, where Montana was covered in a very thick blanket of smoke, it was basically smoke-free the entire night. So we're feeling very lucky here in western Montana to not have any of the smoke from the wildfires, which means we don't have anything locally. So all good here in Zootown.
Clearly, the cultural level of the podcast has just gone up. My wife commented after last week, she was like, does anyone listen to that? And half of what we say, she's really not quite sure about. So anyway, so I was like, okay, maybe we should, jump to, or where's and I talked to my mother this weekend. We went home. So I was like, she had started listening and there was just a lot of banter. So perhaps we should cut to the chase even faster to let the first time listeners know that, yes, we are going to talk technology news here, but we do tend to start with weather and other, small little chit-chat.
Right. Wes and I are friends, so that's the bottom line. You're going to have us, catch up on the week with us. So
yeah, if you want to join us for our little weekly get-together, that's great.
Right. Yeah. The coffee's on us. So, well, Wes, lots of interesting things going on. I think I intended on going something a little different first, but I think we should do this first because it's kind of nostalgic for me. 2 big anniversaries this week. One's a little more practical than the other, but Google, like the search engine, Google turns 20 this week. What started out as a graduate student project at Stanford became, Google, which is obviously one of the world's most important companies. And I was actually thinking about this when I spotted this retrospective on The Verge, and I would suggest for those of you that are not aware of the history or maybe want to see kind of the retrospective of 20 years of Google, The Verge has a wonderful article in today's edition. The link, of course, is our website, edtechsr.com, but I actually was thinking about when I started using Google, and I actually remember this pretty well. In the late 1990s, I was a teacher in the Helena School District, which is where I started my career and taught most of the years of my career, and I was becoming a fairly popular professional development presenter inside my school district, where I would do 3-hour workshops, and most of the stuff I was doing pretty early on was ridiculous but popular. The title that actually some of my friends still make fun of, but I could get butts and seats, what's called Jason Mines the Web. It's like random stuff that I ran into on the internet, and here it is, yay, the internet. But I'd been using Meta like Meta Search, Meta Crawler was the name of the search engine, which was the Geeks search engine, right? Because Metacrawler searched all the search engines. So if you were a web crawler fan, or you were a Dogpile fan, or you were any of the popular search engines back in the day, Metacrawler crawled them all, and then you could. I know it's, and even the name sounds silly now, right? And I would teach about search engine strategy and the importance of safety in search and be careful with kids. And I had a friend who actually now is in the upper management of PayPal, and then was working at Intel in Hillsboro, Oregon, who I was in pretty close contact with, and he had said, "Have you heard of Google?" And I was like, the name was silly, kind of weird. And, the early days, it was distinctive because Google was a search engine that was basically the name of the search engine in a box, not unlike it is today. And that was something that was extraordinary for 1998. Every single search engine, every single meta site that tried to catalog the web, like Yahoo, it was an advertising nightmare. It was cluttered. It had kind of a overly designed newspaper feel to it, and Google was awesome because it was super simplistic, and the advertising that eventually made it on Google was just tiny little ads that were not pop-ups. They did not flash or blink or cause people to go into convulsions. Like, it was just a really simple interface, and it didn't take long for the nerd set, including myself, to figure out that Google seemed more accurate because they had an algorithm behind what they were doing that felt smarter and felt less maybe artificial, and it seemed really just authentic and fast. And so that was the start of Google for me. So Wes, when did you start using Google?
Well, I was being a technology teacher and facilitator at Rush Elementary School in Lubbock, Texas. And I was basically teaching 4th, 5th, and 6th graders half of the day, and then integrating with teachers. And we were using Yahoo. And I remember, that was when the web was being curated by hand. And so we had what was that called when you had the topical? There's some fancy words for that, as far as the categories and the hierarchies, the hierarchical web. There's other words for that, but oh gosh. My friend Tim Kane, who graduated a couple years ahead of me at the Air Force Academy, I was communicating with him for some reason, and he had asked me kind of a similar thing about Google, and I'm like, what is that? And then, discover this world. But, we were still into Yahoo, and I will admit in that same era, this just makes me cringe. We're doing so much with student email and safety. I actually helped my students create their own Yahoo accounts at that time, which, was not, with hindsight, a real safe thing. But those were the early days of the web. So yeah, and that's when Alan November was teaching everybody how to use Alta Vista and do, advanced Boolean searching.
Right.
I think, or that time, that was shortly thereafter. So yeah, lots of companies that have come and gone, and here we are 20 years later, as we'll talk about in the show, contemplating whether Google's too big, and whether Google and Facebook and these other companies are going to face antitrust legislation, and just how massive they are, and if they're not going to be stopped by any kind of governmental regulation, they're going to kind of swallow the world. It's not just one company, but I say that very happy to have drank the Google Kool-Aid, very, thankful to be using their tools on a daily basis, and definitely thinking that, the world is a better place because of what Sergey and Larry created in their dorm, and, what's grown as a result. But it certainly spiraled beyond anybody's expectation 20 years ago.
Well, and I can say that with few exceptions, when I've adopted a Google tool, it usually replaced something that was much worse than the Google tool, right? And I can think of examples of that. The rollout in, I think, of 2003 and 2004 was the rollout of Gmail. For those of you that don't remember that or were on the bandwagon much later, the tool was extremely popular because of its very simplistic design and the fact that they didn't cram advertising down your throat to send and receive email. It was so popular with especially the tech set in the United States that they had an invite system where you could get an email or a Gmail address, and then you can invite 5 others who could invite 5 others, and then over time you got more invites, and eventually became a website you could just go sign up on. But the reason why they were popular is because they were the first to give, and I want to say it was a gigabyte of space or something. They just weren't afraid to to allow you to store all your email. Whereas if you were on some of the older web-based services, or you rolled your own email, which is what I did for a number of years. I used to have email at knifer.com where I'd host on a website, and I had hosting for that email. And the joke was that with students is I would tell them my email address was anything at knifer.com, because I had set up to where I had a blanket email box, and so my kids would get kind of creative about what the anything was, and half of them just emailed the word anything at knifer.com, right? But that was great, but not very secure in retrospect. And then more importantly, the tools to manage that were terrible. And
the spam became unmanageable.
Yeah, and so for me, Gmail was a real revelation. I've had the same Gmail account since 2004. I haven't had to change email accounts, and I have the same one I did from day one, and that's been pretty great. And I've very much enjoyed that.
The other anniversary is the Chrome browser, and so we've got Tom Warren's article from The Verge. Google's Chrome browser is now 10 years old, and so he's noting that Chrome on the desktop now boasts a 60% browser market share. I mean, think about where we were, 20 years ago. Apple on the ropes, Microsoft, making the investment to try to help save Apple. Internet Explorer in the emerging internet. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess we weren't using Internet Explorer quite that early, were we? Or maybe we were. Certainly by 2000. If we go ahead 10 years, I mean,
right.
Chrome has been a revelation. I mean, Firefox and definitely open source, and there's roots there with Netscape.
Right, Netscape Navigator. Yep.
But
I was just looking at the timeline. And it was 2002 when Firefox was released, and Firefox, I believe, was resurrected from the ashes of the Netscape Navigator. I think they're related in some way, shape, or form. And then Internet Explorer obviously became very popular, but when Chrome was released in 2008, it was a really welcome alternative to Internet Explorer, and to a lesser extent Firefox, although a lot of people still stay with Firefox today. And I have to say, Firefox has gained new respect on my icon bar because it's fast. I mean, I would say it's equally fast to Chrome, and depending on which website you're talking about, it probably goes back and forth. But the simplicity of it, the fact that they were trying to move away from toolbars, which was a very popular way to add functionality to a browser in 2004, 5, and 6, but they were super spammy and oftentimes had spyware installed on them. And the simplicity of the Chrome browser, for me, was a real revelation as an end user.
Absolutely. And from a security standpoint, not only the Chrome browser, but the Chrome OS, as far as Chromebooks, which, have come as a result. This article in The Verge, says that Chrome is sort of risking, or on the edge of becoming the new Internet Explorer 6 because of its dominance. But the emphasis on web standards, we're now seeing Google with the works best with Chrome, messaging, and even at school. I mean, we put Firefox and Chrome on everybody's machine, whether it's a Windows or a Mac computer. But we definitely encourage folks, because we use and do so much with Google, to, go ahead and use Chrome. So anyway, I think these are great anniversaries to celebrate. I think it's wonderful to see, what Google has done to the computing landscape. And in terms of reinvention, it's critical that we continue to push the envelope with security and look not only to the web browser, but beyond the browser as far as the operating system. And so the ways Google is iterating in that way, I think, are super important. It's also pretty amazing to see what Microsoft is doing and the way all of that is actually moving. So,
right. Absolutely.
But yeah, these are celebrations for sure.
And then while we're on the topic, one of the things that happened this week is that version 69 of the Google Chrome browser was released, and it's the kind of 10th anniversary release of the browser, and it has come with a number of interesting features. I thought we could go over a couple of these for just a moment. First and foremost, Google's been working on a new design to the Chrome browser, and it's more that goes along with what they call their material design. And this gets a little nerdy, but you've probably noticed in the last 4 or 5 years that the broad internet has become flatter would be the way to utilize that. Less three-dimensional or perceptual three-dimensional images, less what they call skeuomorphism, which is this notion of trying to recreate the physical in the digital. So things like a design that suggests that something is stitched and it's not, because it's a flat surface, right? So trying to create a perception of three-dimensionality. But they're pushing out more material design, and in fact, a couple of weeks ago, you could put in some flags in the Chrome browser and get an early preview of that flat design. In fact, I'm looking. I run my home Chrome setup in the beta mode, which is now showing off that flat design in the Chrome OS. And it's really beautiful. So that's something to look forward to. The other one that's interesting and very timely, well, actually there's several of them, interesting and very timely, is that Chrome is now trying to more aggressively manage passwords. And for a while, Chrome was a great option for managing your passwords. The problem with managing your passwords in Chrome, however, was that for the longest time, they were storing those passwords in an unprotected a decrypted text file on your local computer. So if you were using Chrome to manage passwords and someone had physical access to your machine, it wasn't that difficult to steal that file and get all your passwords. Unlikely scenario, perhaps, but still one that's real. And apparently they're working on a really great password manager. And I'm not, you can go to password.google.com and see more about that. I'm currently a LastPass user, so much so that I'm actually paying for the commercial edition of it. It's just $24 a year. But it's interesting that the Chrome is definitely going in this direction.
So a related article talking about the size of Google and kind of where we've come. We've got under the heading social media correction, which is one of Jason's favorite terms to talk about here on the podcast. And this is from The Verge on September 4th. And it's an editorial called "It's Time to Break Up Facebook." And this is a very well articulated article by Nilay Patel, whose Twitter handle is Reckless. And he mainly cites an author named Tim Wu, who has written a book that's going to be out in November called The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Gilded Age. And what he does is paint the case for, why we've had antitrust law in the United States, how currently the only litmus test in terms of antitrust is whether it harms consumer costs in terms of pricing. And in an age of free products from companies like Facebook and Google, where we are basically the product as far as our data and our information that they're able to utilize and remonetize and then sell to advertisers, that really isn't a measure that, can be meaningfully applied. And so what he is calling for is, actually, he says you don't have to rewrite trust legislation in order to take a look at what's happened with respect to Facebook specifically, because this is not a let's break up Google, this is a let's break up Facebook article, talking about WhatsApp and Instagram and the way in which they can, Facebook consumed those two companies and essentially did away with its meaningful competition. So we've talked on the show about this issue in the past, and certainly in the context of cell phones. Both Jason and I are T-Mobile users. We have been for a number of years, and it's wonderful to see how competition can raise the bar in terms of what kinds of features customers have available to them, as well as prices. And so I think this is a pretty compelling argument. So Jason, if we were to give you fiat power in the debate round, would you be willing to fiat a split off of WhatsApp and Instagram to Facebook, or do you think we should just allow the market to do as it will and just see where that takes us?
So I think about this in terms of the purchase of Instagram by Facebook, and I think it was $1 billion price tag. It was the first acquisition that was a prominent acquisition was in the tech world that was at the B level, right? So $1 billion acquisition. And obviously that turned out to be an extraordinarily good investment on Facebook's part. Instagram's popularity is growing. It's a huge marketing platform now, right? And even though there are other initiatives like Instagram TV has been on a real slow roll, so it's not something that's become a real factor yet, even though it's clear that's part of their future strategy. It's increasing in users, and as people get tired of the political in Facebook, Instagram's a great place to go, right? And I remember this was 4 or 5 years ago at one of those Facebook conferences, F8 or Fate or whatever they call it, the Facebook Developers Conference, that there was some headlines about unbundling the Big Blue app was the kind of headline of where Facebook was going. And the notion was that they were no longer serving their customers when they had everything kind of wrapped into one big old app. So as an example of this, Facebook Messenger, which used to be something that was integrated into the app itself, right? It was something that you access within Facebook, and they added phone calls, and there was all sorts of functionality in Facebook Messenger that was popular. They decided that those need to become separate apps. So Instagram wouldn't get sucked into it. Messenger was separated from it. WhatsApp has stayed separate from Facebook. And, it's interesting because I know a lot of people now actually that are very light Facebook users, but still very regularly use the Messenger app. In fact, my wife is one of them who has largely abandoned Facebook now and spends her time focusing on Messenger app, which obviously doesn't have the pushing content. That's interesting to me in context of this article, because I think Facebook has been trying hard not to become like this, all-in-one behemoth, that they're a company with lots of different interests and lots of different ways they want to help people connect and communicate with one another. I like that analysis, that it's hard to apply maybe our historical notions of what a monopoly is, what a company that's grown too large or has too much control is, because there's no way to even conceptualize Facebook tampering with elections, during the progressive era of American history, right? Like there's no way to even dream about that then. It's an interesting notion. In the same way that there's been a lot talk this week on Capitol Hill in Washington, the Supreme Court nomination hearings have kind of drowned out the other stuff that's been going on. But there have been hearings this week. I think Sheryl Sandberg was on Capitol Hill. The Twitter guy, Jack Dorsey, was on Capitol Hill this week testifying. And there's been very aggressive language on the behalf of senators and representatives that now's the time to regulate these technologies. And I'm not against regulation, right? Like I don't shudder at the notion of that. I think like some people that tend to be rather pro-business are, but I just don't know how you do it, right? Like at what point are you really becoming, when the government does it, when are you then trampling on free speech?
Well, what Patel is saying here, and I think, what's happening in Washington is pretty significant. Google did not send, its CEO or any of its founders. They were sending one of their top legal, people. And I think they were putting like an empty chair with a Google nameplate or something like that at one of the hearings. There's a lot of posturing, obviously, that's going on politically. But this idea of what's the harm? When would something become too big? When would we ever decide that? And that it shouldn't just be about price; it can also be about competition. And so when you see these companies eradicating competition, I think it's important for us to consider, right? I mean, Amazon is on a trajectory to just continue kind of gobbling up the world. I know that we had a lot of the sky is falling with Walmart. But Walmart's a player there too, right? I mean, this is part of the dynamics. And I think these can be called network effects, as far as once you get to a certain point, network effects set in. And then, you can obviously screw up and there's no, guarantee that all this is just going to, keep on getting bigger and bigger. But that is the tendency for these companies. And so I think this is a great article to take a look at. And it's really a great one from an economic standpoint to look at as well, in terms of the law and antitrust, and thinking about harm, and then thinking about competition, and what kind of a society do we want to have here in the United States? We have tended to be a very hands-off, regulation is evil, sort of, Ronald Reagan, bureaucracy bad. We've kind of taken that in. And of course, that's also related to what is happening with the Supreme Court. I think to a much greater degree with the polarization and fracturization of society, both parties, all parties, see the extreme importance of the folks sitting on the bench and the way in which they interpret the law and the way in which they stay there for a real long time to have a long influence,
Right.
on the course of how our legal system works and how laws are interpreted and how values are represented within society. So anyway, it's going to be interesting because I know there's just going to continue to be a lot of posturing. We've heard a lot, recently as far as the steps that Facebook and Twitter are taking to try to crack down on, fake accounts. But I also think we should just realistically brace ourselves for, more headlines that are going to be about voting machines, that are going to be, about the ways in which we've influenced folks. Because as we've talked about on the show before, when it comes to this idea of fake news and information, a lot of that has to do with identifying bad actors, and that does have to do with free speech. So the regulations, can go a couple different ways, and part of that can try to push these companies to censor and regulate more the kinds of expression that happens on their platforms. But I think in this article, talking about just the economics of it and how Europe approaches this differently from the United States in terms of what the harm is, and looking at competitiveness.
Right.
So this would definitely be something very timely, to talk with your students about if you're doing anything related to economics or teaching economics. And it will be most interesting to see what kind of legislation is actually proposed. There's a lot of posturing that happens and sound bites that get made, and empty chairs with Google's name tag, I guess, are being put out there to to have effect. But what would the legislation, if any, be? And it, is this administration or any administration at this point willing to, say that you've become too big, you can't have that acquisition, when consumer prices are going to basically be fine because these products are being given away.
Right. Well, and the other piece to remember here when we talk about regulation is that I'm not very convinced that many people in Congress understand the internet. Right. Like they made a big mockery of it when Zuck was up at the Hill, and they asked some pretty silly questions like, "How do you guys make money?" Right. Like, and it doesn't take a real rocket scientist to figure out what runs the internet is advertising. Right. It's an advertising based medium. But I am worried that a poorly thought through regulation, or worse, a broad kind of, I guess, dictum from Congress signed in haste to try to deal with this, kind of fake news or social media problem. And, and again, not a political show, but it wouldn't, it in a world where we're trying to figure out what the media looks like in 2018, I could see a bill leaving Congress quickly, passing through the Oval Office very quickly, and then it being riddled with First Amendment problems that we'd have to spend years dealing with in court. So that's what also terrifies me about regulation too, right? Like regulation, the number of times we've tried to deal with what are perceived to be really important problems like piracy, oftentimes the rules that deal with things like piracy are way worse, at least from a First Amendment or a privacy or a functionality standpoint, than losing X amount of percentage of media dollars because of piracy. So it's a real careful balance issue. And, a lot of this stuff is done in the name of schools, too. Let's not forget that oftentimes we've created very draconian laws that demand that we lock down things, maybe with too thick of a club, right, where there's clearly a need for schools to step in and protect students, but what does that mean, right? Or if we go too far, does it then take away from the power of the technologies?
Any other social media correction articles you want to talk about there?
Yeah, there was one other that, going back to that screen. Oh, really excellent information from Pew Internet Research Life. This is from their Fact Tank blog. This is from today, and extraordinary numbers. By the way, they didn't use the term here, but this is the trademark technology correction at work. This is from today's Pew Research Center, and they say that, quoting Pew directly, just half of all Facebook users 18 or older say they've adjusted their privacy settings in the past 12 months. 4 in 10 say that they've taken a break from checking the platform from a period of several weeks or more, while a quarter say they've deleted the Facebook app from their cell phone. All told, 74% of Facebook users say they've taken at least one of these three actions in the past year. And that was based on a survey of adults in late May, early June. I think that's an extraordinary thing, right? We started reporting earlier this year after a lot of that Cambridge Analytica stuff came out in 2017, early 2018, that the overall, well, for the first time, Facebook was losing average numbers of active minutes by its users. That trend continued throughout 2018, and now 74% of American adults say they've changed their relationship with the platform. So technology correction is most certainly happening. And Wes, did you take any of those three specific actions?
I definitely did, in terms of deleting supposedly, things that I had liked and indicated. Once you've put them into the cloud, can you really ever take them back? But I definitely changed some of my privacy settings. And last month when I celebrated my birthday, one of the things which I hadn't really realized this would happen, is I changed privacy settings to not allow people to directly post on my wall, which, there are some wonderful things for sure. I mean, we're definitely a pro, sharing and the positive uses of social media, show and advocates here, I think. But anyway, I hadn't realized that until later in the day. And, it resulted in more direct messages and then things that just people had posted on their wall and they had tagged me and whatever. But I did. And, I'm not going to delete my account. I'm certainly not deleting my Twitter account. But I have, changed the way that I'm using the platform and feel like I'm, more aware of the ways in which I'm being marketed to. And I think there are some benefits to that, right? I don't want to just, when you watch mainstream news, and I watch probably more commercials with my family, just being up with my parents because they're watching more TV, and just the whole spray and pray, kinds of advertising, or when you're watching, CBS Sunday Morning, you're like, I think they're targeting an older demographic here with the kinds of medical, advertisements they're doing. I mean, there is probably some value to not seeing, advertisements that are just completely irrelevant and not of interest to us. But anyway, and I think the harm there, is certainly less than it is as a society when we look at democracy and swaying people's, votes and opinions and things like that. I think the privacy harm of being directly marketed to and feeling creeped out because you're like, how did they know that? Are they listening? Is this app listening to me to know that I'm going to want that? That's, I think, at a different scale than some of the things we're seeing in terms of society and democracy, things like that.
Sure. Okay, where shall we go to next, sir?
Well, let's talk a little bit of Apple really quick. So I put this under Apple Leaks and Rumor Mill. 9to5Mac evidently got some exclusive access to some leaked photos and information about the forthcoming iPhones as well as Apple Watch. We know that there's going to be an Apple event coming up on September 12th. And apparently Apple is going to release both 5.8 and 6.5-inch OLED phones that they're going to call the iPhone XS. And they're also expected to unveil the new Apple Watch Series 4. I've been holding out, among other things, for FaceTime and video conferencing. I think I'll definitely be challenged. If I can do the true Dick Tracy, talking to folks on my wrist kind of thing. But this also just kind of shows how it's so hard, as you mentioned before the show, Jason, with the global supply chain, to keep a secret, because the new Google Pixel 3, there was a whole bunch of them that have shown up in the Ukraine and some other places. So, Jason, how many hours a day are you now spending, lusting for the new Apple products that are coming in a few short weeks?
Yeah, I'll tell you, the one thing that gives me any temptation at all to look at an iPhone is the fact that I am now wearing, I'm a diabetic, and I wear a constant blood sugar monitor. It's a new thing for me the last 4 weeks or so, and it's pretty interesting technology. But the thing that I did not expect when I bought this item and had to invest into it was only partially covered by my insurance plan, was that I assumed that it would be connected to my cell phone. But as it turns out, it's fully compatible with iPhones. It is partially compatible with some Android phones. And so I am not particularly happy about that situation. And That's the only temptation. But two things. First, I think I've said this 3 times now. If it's truly the iPhone XS, that is the dumbest name ever. It just does not roll off the tongue. The iPhone XS, like it just your tongue gets in the way. It creates a weird lisp situation. It is not a natural term, and I do not think that's the name. Only because the marketing people at Apple have to know better than that. The other thing about that is that I will be curious when, and they've booked a space for this, right? Is this next week? Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, they have it in their house, right? They don't have to book a space now because they've got the
the spaceship campus thing.
Spaceship, yeah, to have.
I am curious to see like how they did the weird thing with the iPhone 8 and then the X or 10 phone. They're going to have to, and obviously they're just going to pretend that 9 never happened, so they'll go with the X branding, I guess. But I've heard 3 phones. I've heard some other rumor sites that claim that there's evidence for more than that, even though there's been leaks that say only 3. Like I am curious to find out what that looks like. So, and
it looks like they may be coming out with some less expensive phones. So if the OLED phones are still there, Apple made more money than ever selling $1,000 smartphone and really shifting the whole market to more expensive phones. But there evidently are some good rumors that they're going to have a less expensive phone that's not going to opt for all of the super fancy of what was in the iPhone 10. So yeah, it'll be exciting, and I would definitely commend Swappa to you. Hopefully, I think we're gonna sell some phones on Swappa here. We need, obviously, the sooner you do it, the better. When the new phones come out, because I'm sure somebody's done a graph, showing as soon as that Apple event happens, what's happening to those next models. But the good news is there's, just like with Android, there's a heck of a lot of capability you can get in last year or 2 years old model, and at least Apple's iOS is going to probably still be functional there. It's not like you're going to have to get the latest and the greatest to get the best, the best software experience. So.
Right, absolutely. And the other piece that that ignoring phones, I am interested in. There's apparently forthcoming new MacBook Airs. That's interesting to me. I'll keep an eye on that. And then, I do feel like that there's this vague energy around maybe something new from Apple from either laptop or desktop standpoint. So I hope that's the case.
Definitely. I'd like to do a couple quick ones on the privacy surveillance. This is an absolutely fantastic article. This is the New York Times on August 31st. The title is Hacking a Prince, an Emir, and a Journalist to Impress a Client. And this is talking about companies that are creating spyware, and they're not just using it so that teenagers can jailbreak their phones and install Cydia and some new wallpapers. They're selling this to governments, and they're claiming this is being sold only to crack down on terrorists and criminals. But as you might expect, different companies are using this to crack down on their political rivals, using it in times of elections to spy on their competitors. That's something that I think has happened in Mexico, cracking down on human rights defenders. So there's lawsuits now that Mexican journalists and human rights defenders have filed against this company. And so one of the biggest arguments here in questions in the article is, should companies that manufacture and sell smartphone spyware be held liable for its illegal use by governments? And this is pretty interesting. I mean, it's different, but it kind of makes you think a little bit about, say, assault rifles. I mean, if you're selling a fully automatic assault rifle and you're putting that on the market, at some level I think it makes sense that there's some kind of liability there, and that there should be some kind of limitation in terms of the sale and distribution of that kind of a weapon. And we're talking about weapons here. It's just a weapon that's software, but it's being able to target political rivals and those sometimes are domestic and sometimes they're international. So I just found that fascinating. And then a related article from The Verge on September 3rd notes that the U.S., the U.K., and other governments are asking tech companies to build backdoors into encrypted devices. And this is a continuing refrain that we hear from security, advocates. And in this case, it is a memo that came out at a meeting that's called the Five Eyes Pact. It's an intelligence sharing agreement between the U.S., U.K., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And in the memo, the government stressed that these backdoors would only be for, quote, lawful access to a device, such as a criminal investigation. And they plan to start by encouraging tech companies to voluntarily add them, but the backdoors would only be voluntary to a point because the government say they might mandate a way in which they continue to, if they continue to encounter impediments to accessing encrypted data. So I think I know the answer to this, Jason, but where do you stand on the issue of encryption? And do you think that companies like those that are building this spyware should face some liability for their illegal use, even when it's by a government?
I do. And I think that, I'm generally a company, should be held liable in cases where their tools are used for misfortune, aggressive misfortune. But at the same time, like in a lot of cases, the intent here was quite negative when these tools are used, and they're used for aggressive, nefarious purposes without any redeeming value to them. And yeah, I do. And I won't go into a lot of detail because it would be a long story, but they've been helping some people lately in context of both work and home, try to ungum up their machines because things have been installed on them, plugins in Chrome, plugins in Firefox, malware installs with handy applications. And to be clear, I get stuck by that sometimes too, right? I usually can root it out right away because I recognize the telltale signs of the doom. But there is a lot of really junky stuff out there whose entire intent is either to serve you advertising or you take your data away, right? And do you think we need to set up some basic norms about what we expect out of things like software and hardware, and then enforce companies that can't play within those social rules? So yes, absolutely. I think there should be a much more scrutiny of companies in this regard.
Related to the idea of regulation and what government should do, there's a really interesting article that comes from the Wikimedia Policy Medium account, and the author is the chair of the Wikimedia Foundation, Maria Safadari Huichi. I'm not going to say her name right. But her article is called "Your Internet is Under Threat. Here's Why You Should Care About European Copyright Reform." So very interesting about what's going on, right? We've got the GDPR that's now enforced by Europe that is supposed to be causing companies to be more forthright in their statements about the ways in which data is going to be used, but also potentially impacting, where that data is housed. And that is a fundamental challenge to the internet and the way it's been organized and the way it's worked in terms of saying, you can access my server wherever it happens to be. And this is talking about copyright laws, which might be requiring companies to, take certain information down. This is really over on the freedom of speech side of these discussions. And so from the perspective of Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation, looking at trying to make the world's encyclopedia, the best encyclopedia in the world, free and comprehensive, and, having, open licenses, this could really impose a lot of burdens, on everyone, and it could put some folks out of operation. So yeah, the way that all of this evolves in the next few months and years is, potentially going to be a pretty big deal as far as how the internet is allowed to grow and what people are allowed to do and not do. So I'm not sure, where to place the bets there, but I think how has your thinking about the social media correction changed since you initially kind of came up with that term in terms of where it's going and how regulation plays into it?
Sure. Part of it is that I do think that we're becoming numb to it a little bit, right? Like I think the part of the problem with the fact that a lot of these apps are built to be a little addicting. I actually encouraged, maybe is the right word, by the Pew study that we talked about a little bit earlier this episode, because I think that that's a sign that people are seizing more control over their lives in regards to social media. But I guess well, I'll tell you, here's where my biggest changes come with that, since I started talking about this a year or so ago. I am questioning a little bit some of our use of technology in classrooms. If a student is stuck in a laptop for 7 hours a day at school, and they go home and their homework is 2 hours of laptop time, and then their social life is 3 to 4 hours of laptop time, and at least some of that, if not half of that, if not most of that, is mostly passive or very relatively inactive time. That's very challenging to me. I think that we're making some decisions that maybe aren't going in the right direction. Obviously, I don't blame schools for integrating more technology into the classroom, other than I think there is a broader conversation that we need to be having here. And the same is also true of me. I mean, very little of my time at work is spent without my eyes in front of a monitor. And, and it's not, and I don't want to make it sound terrible. I like working on a computer. I like my job. I like doing the stuff that I do all day. It's extremely intellectually challenging. It's sometimes, a little tiring or stressful or anxiety provoking, but not in a way that it's impacting me long term. But then I come home at night, and then I like to read stuff on the internet. I like to do nerdy things. I like to occasionally game on a computer. And it's really caused me to question that process. So for me, the social media correction that I do think is a real thing, it's like I just don't know what the end game answer is here, right? It's probably not about tricks. And I know, Wes, I believe you had posted this week about the YouTube now telling you how much time you're spending on that. In fact, I immediately looked that information up, and I do spend a fair amount of time on YouTube. I love YouTube. YouTube is the best, but what do I do with that?
And that brings it back to the educational focus and thinking about whether it's a parental focus or teacher focus. The conversations we need to have. We all need to be making decisions about the tools that we're using, how we're using them, what we're choosing to share or not share. And I think that the conversations that we're having are healthy ones. And they need, they definitely need to be sustained as far as what we're doing with these devices. As a related side note, friend of mine and former coworker who is not at our school anymore, but he's now at Tinker Air Force Base. I just talked with him today on the phone, and because he's doing classified work, I mean, he literally has to leave his phone in his car all day when he is at work, and he absolutely cannot do work email at home. And I was like, wow, what's that like? It's created this separation and buffer. Not that I'm doing a ton of work email all the time, but anyway, the idea of where is there a boundary, and if there's not going to be one drawn, are you going to draw one? How are you going to model that in your organization? How does health and wellness, and my wife and I have used that term, digital discipline. How does that fit in terms of what you do, and how much you're mindlessly scrolling, and how much you're face to face. So anyway, there's definite regulation and things like that to follow, and there's advocacy to do. If you've got strong opinions about this, I would encourage you to reach out to your representatives and your senators and share what you think about these things, because thankfully we still do live in a country where constituents are able to speak out, and hopefully your elected officials are going to be responsive to your voice and the voices of others. So that does matter, but I think the individual choices that we make with these tools, is really important as well. And we're having healthy conversations about that. And in general, I think the spotlight which is being shown on these issues is positive. It also, is a testament to why journalism is so important, and free and open journalism. We haven't had the article in the show, but Myanmar has been under this, tons of criticism because of ethnic cleansing, and the United Nations had a group that just released a report, and the role that evidently Facebook played in fanning the flames of ethnic hatred. It's just, it's really important for spotlights to be shown on things. And, there's actually journalists, I think, now that have been sentenced to prison time based upon social media posts and things like that
right.
they were reporting. So anyway, freedom of speech, expression, journalism, the fourth estate, these things are a bit under siege today politically. And so I think it's important for us to exercise our freedoms, and for us also to champion them. And, the demonstration effect of us, hopefully being able to seek peaceful political change and being able to advocate, for these issues is really important, because as you said earlier, we should not rely upon the politicians to completely understand all of these dynamics that are happening, with these companies and with things like the internet that are technological. So hopefully the legislation and things like that we see are not going to do irreparable harm to innovation and to sharing and creativity. But on the other hand, I would say that hopefully we're not going to completely have a laissez-faire, hands-off approach and, just allow an uninterrupted sort of Pac-Man consumption of just continuing to, the bigger can continue to eat the small, and all competition is wiped out. So anyway, it's going to be very interesting to see, even beyond the freedom of speech issues, which I think are even more problematic, where this goes with respect to size of companies and things like that. And what will Google say, right? Because, certainly right. Google, as well as Facebook and Amazon, will want to weigh in on that.
Okay, well, we're coming near the top of the hour here. I did want to talk about one other quick thing that is kind of a more practical thing. A really great article from our good friends at Chrome Unboxed about how there is a new generation of higher quality Chromebooks that are coming onto market, and ultimately it proves that the Pixelbook, which, the 3 generations of high-end Chromebooks released by Google have been mocked pretty aggressively, actually, in lots of areas in the media. But even though I know a lot of people with Pixelbooks, I didn't know almost anyone with a Chromebook Pixel, either the 2013 or 2015 model. I know a lot of folks with Pixelbooks. But the article talks about that kind of inspiring a middle to higher tier of Chromebooks was Google's goal in releasing the beautiful Chromebook Pixel, and there are now a series of pretty decent medium to high-end laptops available from various manufacturers ranging from Acer to HP that offer that kind of medium or high-end experience. And I would add a couple caveats to this, and actually right now at work I'm in a process of, we have a field team of what we call ambassadors that work with the Ed Ready Montana project, which is one of the things we run out of our offices at the University of Montana. And we currently have them out with pretty low-end Dell business laptops. And it's just not easy to manage remote laptops with Windows. It's just not. It's not something that, and I get you kind of surprised that Microsoft hasn't come up with an easy way to do this. But the thing that that's been interesting about this is we're starting to run into some plugin issues. Occasionally some malware is getting installed by accident, and we're going to move totally Chromebooks with that crew. And it's going to take some adjustment to workflows and stuff. The reason why I mention this is because the one area that I still think is not, like they're coming out with great HD screens. They're coming out with decent chips. Some of the higher-end Pentium chips and Celeron chips are now becoming fast competitors. More importantly, there's i3, i5, i7, M3, M5, M7 Chromebooks that are released. The one thing that manufacturers are doing a terrible job at, however, is that they still seem pretty stuck at 4 gigs of RAM. And I get that for most users, it's probably not an issue, but for anyone that's even approaching power issue, I think 8's got to be the minimum now. But really interesting that I've noticed that trend as well, and I didn't necessarily associate that with the Pixelbook, but I'm really glad that that's where this seems to be going.
Well, that is fascinating to hear you talk about that as far as work. And, we support Windows desktops and laptops, Mac desktops and laptops, and Chrome, as well as iPad. And so as we approach our next refresh season, we're definitely going to be seeing what Apple is going to be hopefully announcing here in a couple weeks. We were tempted last year to take a look at some Chrome devices, and I think that the emergence of this higher end Chromebook, because we got to look at return on investment, right? We've had wonderful return on investment on our Macs. I mean, I am really, really sad to see these 2012 era MacBooks that, you know, we can replace the battery, we can replace the hard drive, you know, swap out keyboards. There's a lot of things that we're able to do in-house with these devices. And hey, we've got teachers that still like to play DVDs, you know? So anyway, I know it's the progression of technology, especially as far as the DVD and the optical drives go, but we were tempted last year to look seriously at offering Chrome as an option. And as a technology director at a school, from the security standpoint, you know, from cost, certainly, but also just from the how easily can we support this and can we ensure this is safe? There's really no comparison between a full-blown Windows OS or even a Mac OS today and something so light and, you know, refreshable with a good power wash as a Chromebook. So I think we'll also be looking at iPads. I mean, we're doing a lot with Seesaw, and it's going to be that's actually where with Chromebooks and, you know, the world facing cameras and possibly, you know, if it's going to be a yoga style convertible laptop or even a detachable screen, all of those things are important. Interestingly, with our parents, particularly with our youngest kids, there can be a stigma to having your phone out, even if you're taking pictures. Let's say for a Seesaw portfolio, there's a stigma with having a phone out. Having a larger device like a tablet out, you know, is something we're talking about. You know, perhaps that's something we can help educate parents about. Like, this isn't just being on Facebook or social media. You know, we're using this for an educational purpose. I'm going to be very interested to continue following this, especially with the higher end Chromebooks, because again, that ROI is important, and, you know, we have a 5-year cycle. So if we go with a typical cheap end Chromebook and, you know, they're telling us that's going to have a shelf life of 3 years, that's just not going to make it. So it'll be important to see what the longevity of these other Chrome devices are. And also related to what we talked about last week, you know, how long is Chrome or is Google going to support the Chrome OS on them? All of those things are really important. So
yeah, absolutely. So okay, is there anything else we should do before we Geek of the Week up?
I don't think so. I'll go first, and this will be quick. I'm going to just do one. My Geek of the Week is a website called Relive. It is relive.cc. And shout out to Marco Torres. I put a link to his tweet, which actually goes to his Instagram. But this is a very cool geomap tool. And so if you click the example and then click to his Instagram page, you can play the video. He took this really long, like 24-mile bike ride with his boys. And so you play this, and so it has a really neat satellite view zoom in with these place marks, and then where you've taken the photographs, it pops up and then shows you those pictures. So you get to relive your experience, you know, in this case, seeing where they drove along the beach there on the California coast, and just really pretty amazing. So I have not used the tool yet. I just saw this, I think, last night or the night before, but I'm always a fan of geomap tools. And so I will be adding that to the Show with Media site on the geomap page, which you can find at showwithmedia.com.
Great. That's really interesting. I'm going to take a look at that later tonight. And I want to remind an old one that's probably from pretty early on in our run here of the podcast. Cloud Ready is a product from Neverware, and it basically takes a computer, a Mac or PC, and it installs a version of the Chromium operating system, which is the open source version of Chrome OS. The reason why I mention this is because and maybe I'm a nerd, but the point being that at work now, I mean, I have access to great hardware, and I keep going back to my desktop computer, which is an 8-year-old workstation. It happens to have a nice advanced chip in it and 16 gigabytes of RAM, but it's something that you could buy for $100 on eBay, right? We're talking about cheap old workstations that have powerful chips for 2010, not so powerful for 2018, but I've stuck 3 monitors on my workstation and have installed the home version of Cloud Ready on it, and it is easily my preferred work computer. And for those districts that have low resources, that have access to free or cheap used hardware. For example, in the state of Montana, all recycled hardware from state agencies goes to a warehouse where it's then available to schools. I cannot believe how fast and useful Cloud Ready is. Now, if you're using it at school, you should buy a license so you can manage it in your Chrome Chrome management system. But a couple of weeks ago, I happened to be listening to a presentation from a principal in Montana, and she was kind of bemoaning the fact that that even for administrators, they were using used hardware from the state was her daily carry of a laptop, and it was a big kind of clunky laptop from 5 or 6 years ago. But I was watching this laptop choke on Windows 7, and it was slow and not particularly useful. Well, I've taken a 9-year-old laptop that was a high-end laptop 9 years ago that I purchased for well under $100 to test Cloud Ready on eBay, and it ran snappily enough to where I could use it as a power user myself. So if you haven't given it a shot yet, you take an old PC, take an old Mac, go to your state if you've got the opportunity to get corporate donations for hardware. Test this out once or twice, and if you can look past the fact, some people can't get around the fact that the Chrome OS is perceived to be tough to use for some. But if you're buying Chromebooks anyways, give this a shot. It's just really an amazing platform, and I can be productive on it. Anyone can be productive on it.
How old with the processor would you go back? Like, what's the oldest Intel processor you'd use with it?
I would say that if it's, assuming it's one of the N-Case Core 2 Duos, so 2009-ish would be a legit use. And then I would say anything that's got an I in front of it, i3, i5, i7, going back to the earliest of those processors. I have tried myself to in fact, it was an early i5 laptop we had sitting in the office, and this thing was not a speedy one by any stretch of the imagination. It was slow when it was donated to us in 2010, and I've used that as I wouldn't say I was a daily driver because I probably used it for a couple of hours and just to see how it worked. But you can get away with quite a lot, and especially if you're in an area where there's a corporation that's regularly looking to give technology to schools, there's a decent chance that you might get laptops that are 2, 3, 4 years old. And those business laptops, the really hardy business laptops, are kind of built to be fast. Throw a cheap SSD drive in there, you can get a tiny one that's used, lots of them for next to nothing, and it makes a perfectly acceptable workstation that I think you can really do anything on. So Cloud Ready, Cloud Ready, Cloud Ready, Cloud Ready, Cloud Ready.
Awesome.
Okay, well, Wes, where can we find you out on the internets?
I am W. Fryer on Twitter and speedofcreativity.org, and I have rebooted my little newsletter and little video library, and I'm starting to do a Sunday newsletter as well as a screencast that I'm publishing out on playingwithmedia.com. So those are some new places I'm publishing in recent weeks.
Excellent. And I am at Tech Savvy Teach on Twitter. I also work with the Northwest Council for Computer Education, where I am the Tech Savvy Teacher in residence. Actually, I'm the Tech Savvy Administrator in residence. My buddy Mike is the Tech Savvy Teacher. We have new initiatives rolling out, and we're going to be refurbishing our YouTube channel. So look out for interesting tidbits and information related to tips we can offer there. But when Wes and I are not tweeting, videoing, newslettering, we like to do this podcast, which is the EdTech Situation Room. We are here on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Central, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 3 a.m. UTC. And if you can't join us live, although, hey, please try. We wish you would. We love to have people in the chat room. Sometimes you can bring people into the episode to chat live in our Google Hangout. If that's not your thing, that's fine. You can just go to our website, edtechsr.com, download a tiny, tiny audio file of it. You can see all the links we've posted to our website. And, of course, you can find our podcast wherever finer podcasts are aggregated.
Next week, we will probably be an hour early.
Yeah,
so,
pretty decent chance we'll be at 8 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And, of course, that gives Wes the opportunity to go to bed at a decent hour. hour. So I always kind of feel bad that sometimes you process the podcast after we're done.
I've switched that. I'm processing in the morning, so
good.
It's all good. It's all good.
So we love it when you stop by, and we're happy to have viewers. Tell your friends, tell your EdTech friends about the podcast. Leave us a review in iTunes. Leave us a review in Stitcher. Helps more people find the podcast, and we appreciate you listening or viewing. Thank you, and good night.